Chapter 12, Year 5, Part 2. "What time are we supposed to meet Hermione at Three Broomsticks again?" Neville asked, searching distractedly through his pockets. Harry glanced at his watch. "In about 5 minutes, so we should get going," he said. "What are you looking for, anyway?" "I think I've forgotten them inside," Neville mumbled. "The tweezers for my Mimbleless Mimbletonia. You know how touchy it's been since the Weasley twins borrowed it for sting sap. I should never have let them near it." "Just go check in the shop," Harry recommended, waving at the door of Dervish and Bangs. "I'll wait for you here, all right?" Neville disappeared inside with a promise to be quick, and Harry leaned against the wall by the door. The first Hogsmeade Saturday happened to fall on a crisp and mercifully dry October day, and it was positively liberating to escape outside the school bounds for a while. Hogwarts was currently an arena for a high-stake game of hide-and-seek, and everyone was a player. So far, the dueling club had managed to stay off of Umbridge's radar, but the club kept growing, and Harry worried that, sooner or later, there would be a leak. Umbridge had also taken to inspecting Hogwarts teachers' classes, which rattled everyone's nerves. McGonagall walked around with an expression of a cat whose tail had been stepped on, and Harry had heard awful stories about Trelawney's assessment. He could only be happy that Hagrid wasn't around, or else he'd be fired on sight for being a half-giant. Harry's eyes followed a blonde girl with braided hair. He couldn't quite see from here, but she looked kind of like Susan Bones, and wouldn't it be fortunate if they just happened to bump into each other? And then Harry felt a prickling at the back of his neck. He looked around, alert at once. Everywhere around him students milled about, chattering between themselves, and Harry couldn't figure out the source of his unease. Everything seemed fine, but then he saw it. Just a few feet away, a very large blond man in dark robes was heading in his direction. The man wore a pleasant expression on his face and looked for all the world like he was just taking a walk, but something about him gave Harry a pause. Something. The way he glanced around surreptitiously and held his wand close. Harry felt his heart start beating faster. "I should get inside," he thought, and already moved to the door to Dervish and Bangs, when he realized that inside a small space with one exit was not where he wanted to be if he was being followed. He slunk away from the wall and headed off nonchalantly, hoping that his pursuer would not realize he'd noticed him. Just a bored student deciding to walk somewhere else. 2 Honeydukes, for example. They had a great cellar with an excellent passage to Hogwarts. Harry saw in a shop window reflection as the man craned his neck to find Harry in the crowd, and then sped up in his steps. Harry ducked behind a heavy-set woman and increased his pace too. He wondered whether he was being paranoid. What if this was just the Order following him again? What if it was a well-meaning tale, not a malicious one? Just then he saw another man heading towards him from the opposite direction. He was walking straight towards Harry, and the massive blonde Harry had already noticed was behind, and their positioning assured Harry that his instincts weren't failing him. The Order wouldn't be hurting him like this. "Contago," Harry muttered, hoping that the disillusionment charm would make him more difficult to find. Harry's mind was a whirl, trying to work through the possibilities. He couldn't see any Order members around, so no help would be coming from that quarter. Would it be better to stay in a crowded area or isolate himself from others? If these were ordinary burglars, Harry would have definitely stayed among other people, but... "You know who could kidnap the lad in Hogsmeade, torture him into insanity, and make him get the prophecy once his mind is broken?" These could very well be Voldemort's people, and they were unlikely to regret catching innocents in crossfire. But Voldemort was lying low, so surely he wouldn't want to attract attention to himself by staging an all-out attack in Hogsmeade. Ministry would hush it up, though, and if Harry knew it, then Voldemort knew it too. Harry felt a spell whiz past him, and his mind was made up. He entered Gladrag's wizard wear, then swerved between lines of clothing towards the back door, muttering apologies to customers he narrowly avoided collision with. He exited onto the smaller path that went parallel to the main street behind the buildings, and then ran towards Honeydukes. He was already past the back of Zonko's when the sound of running feet echoed behind him. "Potter, stop!" Harry glanced behind him to see the blonde from before chasing after him. Harry sent a stunner flying at his bulky form, followed quickly by a choking curse. "Stop! We only want to talk to you. Stupefy! Impedimenta!" Harry briefly wondered at the way the Death Eater made the easy curses verbal, almost as if he wanted Harry to know what he was casting. "Fracta Ossum!" Harry fired in response. Judging by the wail that sounded from behind, Harry's bone-shattering curse was a success. He sprinted forward. Almost there, he could already see the sign for honeydukes, when he felt a whole barrage of non-verbal spells hit his shield and staggered. He poured all his might into holding his shield up. They were mostly stunners from what he saw, and body binds and other non-lethal curses, but they were all powerful and precise and vicious, and he had no time to fire spells of his own. He felt his disillusionment charm slip. Harry turned around fully and saw that there were 2 Death Eaters behind him now, and while Harry had managed to injure one of them, the other was in top form and firing an unrelenting volley of spells at Harry's shield, and Harry felt that he would not be able to hold it up much longer. "Potter," the second Death Eater said, "there is no need for anyone to get hurt, if you only listen to us." Harry dove from the next incoming curse. "Kaio," he whispered, and rolled out of the way of the next spell. He dodged again, quickly shielded, and fired. "Sigrego!" "We are not here to harm you," the blonde man said, batting Harry's curses away. "We are here just to talk to you, and we have no desire to harm you at all." A stray thought about you trying to use unforgivables, a sure way to disable his attackers, flitted through Harry's mind, but he didn't dare. Not in the middle of Hogsmeade, not when they were punishable by a stay in Azkaban, not with the Ministry's current feelings about Harry. "Vexo," he muttered. "Mulco." "Stop it," the brunette Death Eater commanded, barely sidestepping Harry's last curse. "We swear not to harm you if you cease to attack us." Harry dodged the next curse, a stunner, a non-verbal one this time, and said, "If you don't want to harm me, you've got a strange way of showing it. Macero!" "If you would only stop and listen, we should try to subdue you no further," the man said, almost chidingly. "The Dark Lord has decided that he's been too hasty in his initial assessment of you." Harry reinforced the shield around himself just in time for it to repel a non-verbal Expelliarmus. "And therefore he has sent us here with the mission to offer you to disregard past wrongs and start anew." "Confringo," Harry said automatically, but his mind was reeling with shock. "You are trying to recruit me?" "We're presenting a chance at reconciliation," the blonde evaded, jumping out of the way of an exploded tree trunk with agility surprising for a man his size. The Death Eaters hadn't been truly trying to injure Harry, now that he thought back to their spells. They had mostly fired harmless curses aimed at disabling him from fighting. Still, the idea that they just wanted to talk to the boy who lived was preposterous. "You must listen to us," the blonde declared, wincing as he jarred his injured arm. "Talk then," Harry said curtly. "If that's what you really want to do." He maintained a shield about himself and held his wand at the ready. Looking closer at his adversaries, he saw that neither of these men had been present at Voldemort's resurrection. He didn't think he'd seen them before, although the dark-haired one did seem somewhat familiar. "Of course it is," the blonde affirmed. "We wish nothing more than to convey our Lord's offer." "His offer?" Harry repeated. "What offer?" "The offer of peace." "Yeah, right. You see, Mr. Potter, as it stands, there is no denying some very grave altercations between you and the Dark Lord in the past." "He's tried to kill me, you mean?" Harry said. "And you have tried to kill him," the brunette retorted sharply. "The world might not be aware of the killing curse the boy who lived cast at the end of last June, but the Dark Lord remembers." Was that a threat to expose Harry to the Ministry? "Please do not take this as an insinuation of any kind," the blonde hurried to assure him. "Such desire for self-preservation does you credit. Perhaps Dumbledore would frown upon your actions, but the Dark Lord understands." He made a pause, presumably to let that statement sink in. "And this is why he has deemed it possible to talk to you in a rational manner," he continued. "It is natural that you would attempt to kill a man who is trying to kill you. However, if neither of you regards the other as an enemy any longer, there is no need for further conflict. The chance at peaceful life is quite within your grasp. In fact, the Dark Lord offers you more than just peace, the other Death Eater added. He offers you a chance to fulfill your potential away from Dumbledore's stifling restrictions. He offers to teach you in the ways of magic you could never learn by yourself, and guide you on the path to power and knowledge, and become what Dumbledore would never allow you to become. Funny, Harry thought as he stared at the Death Eaters. That didn't sound too terrible. The learning and the peace and the power he could grasp if only he chose. A life not haunted by the spectre of Voldemort because Voldemort would cease to be the enemy. Like that could ever fucking happen. And what would I have to do in return? Harry asked, refusing to dwell on the bitterness of that last thought. Because he'd been given the option to choose peace once already, at the end of last June, and he'd chosen life instead. And he'd known then that he'd have to fight Voldemort till the end, and he had no business hoping for a break now. The dark-haired man smiled. In return, you would have to pledge to never use that knowledge against the Dark Lord. Pledge? Take the Dark Mark and join your side? You have already been marked by our Lord, the man pointed out, nodding at Harry, and Harry's hand automatically flew to his scar. And the struggle between you and the Dark Lord has never been a war of ideals, has it? You have no stake in the ideological struggle between our Lord and Dumbledore, the blonde Death Eater said. It is not your place to become the champion of Dumbledore's goals. You have nothing to gain by plunging yourself into a conflict that is much older than you. The Dark Lord, the other man said with an air of finality, expects you neither to support our fight against the Muggle encroachment on our world, nor to pledge your loyalty. The only pledge he requests is one of neutrality. Why? Harry asked. Why now? Why would he want neutrality? You are not his real enemy, Harry Potter, came the answer. The Dark Lord has no quarrel with you. He feels that there is no need for you to become his mortal enemy if it can be easily avoided. And this was when Harry knew for a fact that they were bullshitting him. Because Voldemort did have a quarrel with Harry. He tried to kill Harry as a baby, and then again in the Chamber of Secrets, as a mere memory of himself, and Harry was the first guest at Voldemort's resurrection. Harry stood as the symbol of his continued failure and embarrassment, and he was the child of the prophecy and, oh fuck, of course, the prophecy. Harry couldn't believe he'd forgotten about it even for a moment. Voldemort wanted Harry to get the prophecy. Voldemort couldn't imperious him, didn't want to fight him until he knew the contents of the prophecy, but he could try to win him over. And he'd bothered to think of a tempting enough lure. If Harry hadn't been so sure, Voldemort was intending to kill him regardless of the truce. He liked to think that he'd have rejected the offer anyway, but he hated Voldemort that much more for making him wonder. Some of Harry's thoughts must have shown on his face, because the blonde Death Eater spoke up. We will not take an answer now. We are simply here to make the offer, and it still stands, even if you unthinkingly reject it. You have not had the time to... Then Harry heard the sound of running feet, and a voice shouted, Harry! And the nonverbal curse went sizzling towards the two Death Eaters. Harry glanced behind to see Remus Lupin emerging through a gap behind two buildings, poised to fight, but the Death Eaters weren't going to wait for his arrival. Our conversation must be cut short, the dark-haired one said, giving Harry a meaningful look. We trust that you will think on our words, Mr. Potter. With that, both men disapparated, and Harry remained looking pensively at the spot where they had just been. Harry, we've been looking for you everywhere, Lupin admonished, finally catching up to him. What were you doing, Harry? Talking to them? How did you know something was wrong? Harry asked distractedly. Mundungus Fletcher was on the lookout, and he warned us. Lupin gave an exasperated sigh. Instead of helping you, of course. Is that the same Fletcher who was supposed to guard me when the Dementors attacked this summer? The very one. Come along. Still deep in thought, Harry followed. What did they want, Harry? What did they say? Lupin questioned, as they walked out onto the main street. Nothing much, Harry began, but then stopped and sighed. Striding towards him and Lupin down the busy street was Professor Snape, and his expression boded nothing good. He was probably supremely pissed off about having to spend his precious time on searching for the boy who lived, and Harry was sure he'd hear all about it in the immediate future. From prospective Death Eater to errant schoolboy in a wink. Fortune was a fickle bitch. "I will take it from here, Lupin," Snape said, eyeing Harry closely. "Of course, Severus," Lupin demurred. "I'll let everyone know Harry is okay. Some of his friends seem concerned, Harry. Some of your friends seem concerned, Harry. Miss Granger and Mr. Longbottom in particular." Harry started. He'd completely forgotten about their meeting. "Oh," he said. "Yes, I should see them." "I'm sure your fan club can wait, Mr. Potter," Snape said acerbically. Harry was equally sure Snape's lecture could wait, whatever it was going to be about. Snape didn't start shouting at Harry immediately, as Harry had expected, and didn't really say much at all. Once they got to Snape's office, the man just tersely asked whether Harry had any injuries, gave him a piercing glance, and uttered, "Judging by your unharmed state, I presume that the Dark Lord has indeed decided to approach you with an offer of conciliation." "Did you know that this might happen, sir?" Harry asked at once. Because if he had known... "I knew he was considering it," Snape said indifferently. "For your own sake, Potter, I hope you understand the spirit in which the offer was made." "I'm not entirely brainless, Professor," Harry snapped, and took a deep breath. He knew better than this to rise to Snape's barbs. He knew better than to let Voldemort's offer rattle him, and he definitely knew better than to wish his life wasn't this fucked-up endurance test, because sometimes he feared he'd never quite fixed all that got broken last June, and that he'd fall apart if he let himself stop and doubt and wish for impossible things. "I know the Dark Lord isn't to be trusted," Harry told Snape. "I'm not about to fall for his promises of power and glory." "See that you don't," Snape said, and something flashed in his eyes, and suddenly Harry realized that Snape knew what Slytherin was, and what it made Harry, and that Harry had of course done some dark magic where the good guys couldn't see him, and that maybe he wouldn't tell because Slytherins did stick together, but he'd had to check that Harry knew the limits and remembered who his enemies were, and kept his priorities straight. It was somewhat disturbing to find that Snape had seen in Harry for a moment not the boy who lived, but just another Slytherin who might be lured by the dark. If the boy who lived couldn't be trusted to stay on the good side, then who the hell could? Harry sat on his couch in the Slytherin common room, reading the potions textbook and making notes in the margins. He had a test coming up, and although the techniques of making the calming draught sounded supremely dull to him, it was now or never. Quidditch practice had doubled ahead of the match against Gryffindor in 2 weeks at the start of November, and Harry had had very little time for studying. Besides, there was also the Transfiguration essay, and dueling club lessons plans that he had to put together. He'd heard that sleep was fun too. "Harry," Blaise plopped down next to him, ignoring the upholstery snake's menacing hisses. "Prepare to rejoice, for I come bearing good news." "I'm all excitement," Harry muttered. He seriously hoped this wasn't about Blaise's crush on Katie Bell, because then he might have to kill Blaise, and he had no spare time for hiding the body. "Audrey Secus," he intoned, casting soundboards that would disguise the conversation from outsiders. He laid his potions book aside and turned to Blaise. "My mother's finally sent me a secrecy scroll," Blaise said smugly, "and I hope you appreciate the effort, because secrecy scrolls are not exactly tradable goods in this country." Harry leaned against the back of the couch and automatically petted the writhing snakes. "You're right, this is really good news," he admitted. Finally, security arrangements for the dueling club could fall into place. The secrecy scroll was in effect magical parchment, signing which bound people to silence regarding a certain secret, much in the way the Goblet of Fire forced the champions to compete in the Triwizard Tournament. There was one secret allowed per scroll, and signing it constituted a binding magical contract. Once a person signed their name, pledging to honor the secret, they could speak of it to no one beyond the circle of people who'd signed the scroll too. At least, such was the idea. There were, of course, loopholes and limitations. Most importantly, a secrecy scroll's effectiveness diminished the more people signed it, as it covered more people its hold grew more tenuous. Also, the solution tended to work better on weaker, younger wizards, because especially if a scroll's influence was stretched thin enough, strong wizards could maneuver out of its grasp. It was far from the ideal security measure, on the grand scheme of things, but hopefully it would be sufficient for the dueling club. "We'll introduce the scroll at the next meeting," Harry said. "A few people shouldn't sign, of course, or else we wouldn't be able to let new members in." "I hope that by a few people you mean us, your trusted companions." "Yeah, you, Millie, Cedric, Neville, the usual suspects." "It is so wonderful to be among the privileged few," Blaise said dramatically, "who count themselves among your friends, the crème de la crème of the dueling club." "Very funny." Harry rolled his eyes. "Now, if Hermione also manages to find out that communication device she was talking about, we're pretty much set." He took a moment to mull over what a happy state of affairs that would be, and returned to his potions book, only to be interrupted as Millie came into his line of vision and deposited her solid weight on the couch too. Harry muttered under his breath, including her in the sound wards. "Malfoy and Nott are shouting at each other in your dormitory," she announced. "Something about you, Harry." Harry responded with a non-committal, "Huh?" noting down the calming draughts ingredients. "Probably about the fight Harry and Malfoy had yesterday," Blaise drawled. "It's not comme il faut for these dark and mysterious types anymore. You know, our Harry is the sacred cow, to be treated with appropriate reverence." Harry shrugged, still not raising his eyes. Sacred cow was about right. In the wake of the recruitment attempt in Hogsmeade, Death Eater's kids in Slytherin had started courting him with various degrees of transparency, most likely on Voldemort's request. Clearly, Voldemort wanted to reinforce the message of the worry-free life Harry would lead if he chose to accept the offer. Harry's relationship with radical purebloods and Voldemort sympathizers had always varied from strained to outright hostile, but none of them would dare harm Harry now that Voldemort didn't want him alienated, which left Harry in a position of power. Of course, that position was contingent on Harry not revealing his true intentions of rejecting Voldemort's overtures, but Harry could certainly do ambiguity if it bought him time, and he needed time off from fighting the Death Eater faction, which he could devote to building his own power base among students, so that, when the temporary peace went to hell in a handbasket, he'd have a side to call his own, beyond the immediate circle of his friends. Malfoy wasn't having an easy time of accepting Harry's changed status, but Nott was a different story. He'd been circling Harry since the start of the year, offering a helpful comment here, an aloof opinion there, and a witty remark on top, all the while at odds with Malfoy, and evidently this particular trend was going to continue. "It can't go on indefinitely, you know," Blaise said, stretching leisurely. "Sooner or later you're going to have to declare a side." Harry didn't dignify something so trite with a response. Of course he'd have to declare a side. Voldemort wouldn't wait forever, and things would probably come to a head even before Voldemort ran out of patience, if Harry knew the way rumours travelled at Hogwarts. So far, Harry had managed to balance the contradictory messages he was giving out, because his anti-Voldemort face was mostly directed at Dueling Club members, while his ambiguous mask was on while in Slytherin. Outside both these environments, Harry was neutral and perfectly well behaved, lest Umbridge catch a wisp of his leanings in either direction. However, there were Slytherins in the Dueling Club and Death Eater sympathizers in other houses, and whispers had the tendency to carry. Thankfully, Harry was too busy to fret about the timing and trajectory of that proverbial other shoe. "I mean, it might take a while," Blaise continued doggedly. "We Slytherins have never aired our dirty laundry in public, and for what the rest of the school knows, we've always been a big, happy family anyway. Incestuous, from what they say, but happy." Harry snorted. "Damn it, Harry!" Millie exploded, lunging for his book. A short wrestling match followed, which Harry lost. He glared at Millie, while she clutched the textbook to her chest with a triumphant smirk. "What?" he snapped. "I can't decide whether you're being honestly dumb or deliberately obtuse," Millie said. "You're not listening. Yes, we all know that you'll declare a side, and we, and I take that to mean Zabini and I, know what side it's going to be. However, the rest of the school isn't like us. And they might not know. Harry raised an eyebrow. The rest of the school might not believe me when I say that the boy who lived is really, truly not a Death Eater? He had trouble envisaging that. Except in Slytherin. In Slytherin, as usual, things were more complicated. Harry wanted to project himself in Slytherin as an alternate option to joining Voldemort. Most everyone automatically assumed that the Slytherins would become Death Eaters en masse. Harry had heard that accusation thrown around even before Voldemort's return, and hated the stigma. Even he felt that the Order would have preferred the boy who lived to have some other house affiliation, and he was possibly the least marginalized Slytherin of them all. Harry wanted to show his housemates that they had a choice, that they didn't have to be defined by negative expectations. As the result of recent events, however, Harry seemed to be the poster child for young talented Slytherins who had a bright Death Eater future before them, and that was not an image he wanted to cultivate. I suddenly wonder, has it even occurred to you why all the bad guys think you'd make such a splendid bad guy along with them? Blaise inquired. Because the Dark Lord told them to, Harry said dryly. I believe second-guessing him isn't in vogue. Ah, Blaise said, brushing invisible lint off his robe in a gesture that screamed theatrical nonchalance. But our hero is deluded. What am I doing wrong? Harry asked, lowering his wand in frustration. I'm focused. I'm envisaging the final result. Chill, Harry. Eddie Carmichael, a sixth-year Ravenclaw, raised an eyebrow at him. Nonverbal magic is difficult, okay? Getting worked up over it isn't going to help. Eddie's right, Cedric said brightly, addressing more than just Harry now. The key element to casting nonverbal spells is mental focus. And you can't concentrate on the spell you're trying to perform if a part of you is busy being angry about failing. Harry and about a dozen 6th or 7th year students were in the hidden room, practicing separately from the regular dueling club. They were the advanced group which had formed organically after several dueling club meetings, when it had become obvious that there was a great discrepancy between older kids who were fairly skilled and 4th years who couldn't do a simple incarcerus. Naturally, not all older students were great at defense, which was why the advanced group was so small. The twins, for all their brilliance at transfiguration, charms and potions, still attended the regular dueling club, and there were other students like them whose talents lay elsewhere. Harry was the only 5th year here. He'd initially contemplated inviting Anthony and Hermione along, but he and Cedric had decided against it, because being clever was not the same thing as being skilled, and Hermione and Anthony both had a lot of basics to learn yet. They wouldn't be ready to start on the advanced stuff for a while. And the stuff Harry was learning now, by mid-November, was definitely advanced. The 6th years were supposed to have started nonverbal spells this year, and since Umbridge wasn't teaching them anything, it fell to the 7th years to instruct them. Harry had to work extra hard to catch up to where they were, and study nonverbal casting along with them. Apart from nonverbal spells, they focused on curses, which was something of Harry's area of expertise, and soon were going to start on the Patronus. Despite being the youngest here, Harry was still nominally in charge, and coming up with a training program for people who knew more stuff than he did was challenging, but Harry's whole life was challenging, so that was nothing new. Come on, Harry said. Let me try again. Sort of clear your mind before you cast, Eddie advised, moving to stand across from him. Clear my mind how? I don't know. You've done it before, haven't you? If you think back, whenever you managed a non-verbal spell, you were never worked up about it. Harry took a deep breath. He imagined that he would have to face Umbridge, or Dumbledore, or someone else in front of whom he'd have to keep his cool. Petrificus Totalus, he thought determinedly, pointing his wand at Eddie. He felt that something was different this time, and then, sure enough, aha! The curse bounced off Eddie's hasty shield. There you are. Not perfect, of course, but better than your first levitation charm. Harry cast the full body bind again and again, trying to do it faster and more efficiently. He slipped up a few times when he'd let his concentration waver, but Eddie assured him that it was only natural. Fine then, Harry said in the end. How about some curse practice? They set to working on Catalambano, a spell that created magical restraints on a person, binding them on the spot within an invisible shield. The advantage of this curse was that, unless one knew how to look for it, it was devilishly difficult to remove, since its outward symptoms had a lot in common with a full body bind. It also happened to be obscure enough for people not to think of it immediately. "Imagine doing this non-verbally," Eddie said. "That would be super useful." None of them managed it, though. Harry, because his non-verbal casting wasn't yet at that level, and the others also because they were too unfamiliar with the curse. By the time they left the hidden room, Harry was feeling about as energetic as a grated carrot, but he still trudged to the library. He had a couple of hours before curfew, and while his homework was done, the research was never ending, and he had to squeeze it into his day while he still had time. Besides which, close to curfew was a good time to be visiting the library. Most people tended to crowd it during the day, and at night only a few, especially studious ones, remained. People were less likely to notice what he was reading then. "Hello, Madam Pince," Harry said politely, ignoring the librarian's disapproving glare. Madam Pince took his restricted section pass and examined it, checking for forgery, as she did every time Harry came here. His pass was perfectly legitimate, however, signed by Professor Sprout in the belief that Harry would be using it to look up serious texts on plant properties. Since Harry's grades in herbology had been consistently without reproach for his entire Hogwarts career, and he'd passed every potions exam with flying colours, Harry hadn't had a hard time convincing Professor Sprout of the sincerity of his intentions. "Very well, Mr. Potter. I know that you're a responsible student, and Mr. Diggory speaks very highly of you, as does Mr. Longbottom, a very talented boy. I hope you'll put your research to good use." Giving Madame Pince a smile, Harry disappeared behind shelves. It was quiet in the library, and books were whispering among themselves, rustling their pages and creaking restlessly. Harry's fingers ghosted over their spines as he walked past. Most potent potions edged forward at his approach, and an oft-read book on the darker aspect of magic nearly purred at him in expectation, but he hadn't come for them today. He wasn't looking for new spells either, of any variety, those he could share with the dueling club or those he only displayed knowledge of when he was in Slytherin. Today, he was venturing into Blaze's area of interest, history. Lately, he'd started thinking that Blaze had a point when he said that history was important, because knowing spells was good, but knowing your enemy was good too, and Harry just didn't understand some crucial things about Voldemort. He'd always accepted that there were some wizards who followed Voldemort and some who didn't, some purebloods that did, and some that didn't, but he'd never looked into why. Why Voldemort had managed to rise up as he did, why people followed him, and how exactly Voldemort had functioned in the past. Voldemort was clearly keeping tabs on Harry. It seemed to make sense to look into him in return. Triumphalist ministry-sanctioned literature like Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts was not what Harry was looking for. He wanted facts, yes, but he also wanted a look at the Death Eater's motivations. He wanted primary sources, any surviving pamphlets of Voldemort's campaign, records of his speeches, if any existed, and anything that might explain what lured allies to his side. He wanted books that were either unbiased or biased in favour of the Death Eaters, because they were the ones more likely to give Harry a glimpse into their mindset. Harry was gazing thoughtfully between Mudblood Menace and State Power and the Politics of Change when he heard a familiar voice from behind. "Potter?" Harry turned around. Edward Montague was approaching him, his hulking form looking quite out of place in the library, and Harry raised an eyebrow at seeing him. Montague's visit wouldn't have been so surprising last year, when he and other former sixth years had been training Harry up for the tournament. After the third task, Harry's ties to his tutors had disappeared like they'd never been. They had ceased to interact at all, except for frosty exchanges during Quidditch. Until the recruitment attempt in Hogsmeade, that is. "Montague," Harry said, matching the other boy's tone. "Fancy seeing you here." The Quidditch captain's eyes swept over the bookshelf in front of Harry. "Interesting titles you're looking at," he said. "Yes," Harry agreed. "Interesting." Montague was quiet for a moment, and Harry waited for him to get to the point. "That was a pretty good catch in the last game," Montague said finally. "That Weasley twit didn't stand a chance." Harry nodded. Ginny Weasley had replaced Dean Thomas as Gryffindor Seeker, and she could hardly compete with Harry considering his years of experience and his firebolt. However, "So you said after the match, Ed," Harry told him. It was late, he was tired, and they both knew they weren't here to discuss Quidditch. "Yeah, I did," Montague said, and lost some of his awkwardness. "Look, Harry, I'll be frank with you. We got along fine last year, and then shit happened, and I had to be careful, you know. We all had to. You know how things have changed." "And now they've changed again, and someone gave you a nudge to reacquaint yourself with me," Harry concluded. "Voldemort was a pretty damn weighty someone." Montague shook his head. "That's where you're wrong. I mean, I get that you're wary of us. We're all wary of everyone, but I really do think that we'd benefit from having you with us, and it would be good for you, too." "It sounds to me," Harry said carefully, "like you're inviting me to join your club, Ed, and forgive me if I find your willingness to do that a little unlikely." "Do you?" Montague flashed him a toothy smile. "I think you'd fit right in." "I'm the boy who lived," Harry pointed out, because that basically meant that he'd had a side in this war since he was 1 year old, and didn't know there was a side to be had. And didn't that count for something? "Yeah, you are," Montague agreed. "So what?" They stared at each other. "Whatever that title is supposed to mean," Montague said slowly, "it doesn't mean shit with you. Nobody in their right mind would believe it does. Nobody who knows you half as well as I do, and I know you better than most." Harry shrugged. He wouldn't say so, but then it was true that Montague, Pusey, and Bletchley had seen quite a lot of him last year, and had had the time to form an opinion or two. "I've seen the kinds of books you read. I know that you don't like Dumbledore, and I don't think that we haven't all noticed, except Longbottom's bitch Granger, there isn't a single non-pureblood in your circle of friends." Montague smirked. "Don't tell me it was an accident." "Well, no, of course it wasn't, but not for reasons that Montague was thinking. In Harry's early years at Hogwarts, befriending exclusively purebloods had been a safe choice, and Slytherin blood status mattered more than house affiliation. He'd wondered whether the blood status of his friends would come back to bite him in the arse. It now seemed that it would. "I'm not a pureblood," Harry said for the sake of argument. "And when was the last time you were reminded of that?" Harry blinked. He hadn't actually thought of it, but in second year. The last time his blood status had come up was in second year, before the whole Heir of Slytherin business, and after... Has it even occurred to you why all the bad guys think you'd make such a splendid bad guy along with them? With a sudden chill, Harry wondered how aware he really was of the way people viewed him. "Right," he said, filing the thought away for later. Much later, to be puzzled out with the help of fire whiskey perhaps. Goyle still had the stash from their return to the dorms party, and he could be bribed. "What is more," Montague continued, "with us you wouldn't have to hide." "Hide what?" "Anything." Harry didn't like Montague's implication that he knew Harry had things to hide, but it was probably a stab in the dark. Montague couldn't have any idea of the secrets Harry kept juggling on a daily basis, from something as life-changing as the prophecy to his forays into dark magic, which his non-Slytherin friends were blissfully unaware of. "Think about it." Montague clapped Harry on the shoulder, interrupting the pregnant silence between them. "I'll be ready to answer questions, if you have them. All right?" "Fine," Harry muttered. "Fine. Just spiffing, really." "Come on, then," Montague said, glancing at his watch. "It's almost curfew." So much for spending a productive evening in the library. Well, at least Harry had figured out some titles he'd been interested in looking at. Montague had evidently decided to wait for him, and they walked out of the library together. "I've been thinking about our game against Hufflepuff," Montague said, smoothly switching topics. "Your mate Diggory has been running the Doffers ragged, and I have a feeling he's got a few new tactics lined up. He say anything to you about it?" "No," Harry said. "Well, he's up to no good anyway," Montague declared. "And I'm going to," He stopped talking abruptly, but not because he'd thought better of his words. Dolores Umbridge was waddling towards them down the corridor, a bright smile on her face. "Hello, boys," she said. "Cutting it close to curfew, are we not?" She toot-tooted, wagging her finger at them. "We were just heading back to the common room, Professor," Montague said deferentially. "It isn't curfew yet, and we were studying." "Were you, Mr. Montague?" Umbridge assessed first Montague, then Harry, and Harry was suddenly glad for Montague's presence. He wasn't sure he wanted to know what would have happened if he'd bumped into Umbridge alone in the dark castle. If she'd tried anything, he'd have had to retaliate, and it wouldn't have ended well. This way, he at least had a buffer. He should be more careful in the future, though. "Very well," Umbridge said with a magnanimous air. "Run along to your common room. I am sure Professor Snape will be most displeased to hear that you've almost broken curfew." "Thank you, Professor," Montague said, apparently taking all negotiating duties upon himself. It didn't help, because— "Oh, and Mr. Potter?" Umbridge turned to face him. "I'd like you to come up to my office for tea on Monday. I feel that you and I should get to know each other better." She gave a cutesy giggle. "Of course, Professor," Harry said, ignoring this sinking sensation in his stomach. "I'd be delighted." Umbridge nodded at them in the fashion of a queen dismissing her subjects. "Delighted, are you?" Montague asked under his breath when they were a safe distance away. "Sure thing," Harry retorted. "I've always wanted to play Guess the Poison in Your Tea." "Sit down, Mr. Potter," Umbridge said in such a sweetly welcoming voice that Harry wanted to bolt. Instead he gave a smile in return and sat on the chair in front of her desk. Really, he should have expected something like this. Umbridge and he had spent the last 3 months playing an exhausting game of cat and mouse. She suspected that Harry was running a secret organization, but couldn't do anything about it, for she had no proof. With lamentable determination, she kept trying to infuriate Harry into losing his composure, so that he'd give her an excuse to fulfill the promise of pain that was shining in her eyes. Harry, for his part, was careful to maintain a respectful facade, and behave within the decorum of a paparazzi-fearing royal, while scheming behind her back. They both knew that the situation could not continue indefinitely, and something, somewhere, would eventually have to give. "Now, Mr. Potter," Umbridge began, "I believe that you and I have many issues to discuss." "I hope you do not find my behaviour in class unsatisfactory, Professor," Harry said. "Oh, no," Umbridge smiled. "In fact, you seem like a reasonable young man. It therefore saddens me all the more to know that you are ruining your future by persisting to spread ridiculous rumours." Harry put an appropriately concerned expression on his face, trying to ignore the kittens mewling from decorative plates on the wall. Really, did Umbridge have to display her fetishes for all to see? "Do drink some tea," Umbridge simpered, her eyes hard as flints. "Mr. Potter, I simply must ask, why do you insist on making public statements which you know to be lies?" Harry pretended to sip from his cup. "I'm sorry, Professor, but I'm not entirely sure what you are referring to." Umbridge narrowed her eyes, but her tone remained saccharine. "Surely you remember that you have publicly claimed that the Dark Lord has returned, despite the fact that the Ministry knows it to be otherwise." Harry carefully put his cup on its saucer, and looked up to meet Umbridge's gaze. "I'm quite certain that I have not made a public declaration of any sort, Professor. I hold the Ministry in too high a regard to contradict them in such a fashion." Umbridge leaned forward, planting her bosom upon the desk. "Huh! Do you deny, then, that the Dark Lord has returned to life? Do you take your previous claims back?" "I've just said that I don't recall making any claims, Professor." "Potter," Umbridge said, her sweet facade crumbling, "do you or do you not believe that the Dark Lord has returned?" "I do not think it is a matter of belief, Professor," Harry answered seriously. The woman made a visible effort at reining in her desire to throttle Harry. She gave a very fake laugh. "Forgive me, Mr. Potter, but isn't the headmaster's wild tale of the Dark Lord's resurrection based entirely on your account of events?" "I have not discussed this question with him," Harry answered. You may have noticed, Professor, that he and I aren't particularly close." "Yes," Umbridge nodded, looking satisfied. "I have noticed that. Quite prudent of you, Mr. Potter, to stay away from Dumbledore and his machinations. In fact, I would almost approve of you, Mr. Potter, if you did not insist on spreading vicious lies to scare other children." Thank Merlin she did not approve. The idea of conforming to Umbridge's standards of a human being left Harry more than a little nauseous. "I defer to your judgment, Professor," he replied. Umbridge stared at him. He looked back at her. He could do this verbal slalom for a long time. His whole life with the Dursleys and then in Slytherin depended on being able to bullshit his way through. "I see," Umbridge said at last. Harry could tell that she did not, in fact, see. She, like many others before her, had expected a different Harry Potter, and the real Harry, who did not seem obvious and straightforward about anything, was giving her a headache when she tried to figure out how to handle him. Well, good. Harry hoped her brain would combust from thinking too much, and she would die in a violent explosion of blood and toad entrails. And yet, Harry was frowning as he left her office, because he was beginning to recognize that the situation was really twofold. Thing was, despite all the trouble and danger, Harry actually profited from Umbridge's presence at Hogwarts this year, because Umbridge had unwittingly provided him with a rallying point, freeing Hogwarts from the yoke of her rule. Had the Ministry sent a more likeable person to spread their propaganda, Harry would have had a hell of a lot more trouble defending himself against their accusations. As it was, Harry didn't even have to try hard to win converts, and the dueling club was thriving, with new members continuing to join. Moreover, many people felt that if Umbridge was wrong about the way she had hijacked the school with her educational decrees, then Harry had to be right about Voldemort's return, even though one did not necessarily follow the other. In that sense, it was almost in Harry's interests to keep Umbridge at Hogwarts, instead of driving her out, as he'd been initially planning. And then there was another aspect to this convoluted picture. Forced to look beyond the antagonism against Umbridge, Harry realized that she was not actually his biggest problem. Together with Millie and Blaise, he'd once facetiously contemplated the ways to stage a nice little accident that would take care of Umbridge and not implicate them. Harry had seen then that it would not solve anything in the long run. Should they depose of Umbridge, the Ministry would send someone else in her place. Someone, say, more personable and less liable to provoke the students. Someone who might be better than Umbridge at persuading the students that Harry was a nasty, attention-seeking liar. Someone compared with whom Harry would not be a noble defender of Hogwarts, but a recalcitrant child. To resolve the situation at Hogwarts, Harry would need to look higher than Umbridge. Perhaps the Order had the right idea. Persuading the Ministry of Voldemort's return was indeed paramount, because the Ministry, and not Umbridge herself, was the source of Harry's current problems. "Sonorous," Harry muttered, aiming his wand at his throat, and then called for silence in the crowd. "Thank you," he said, more quietly. "Before we begin this session, I have an announcement to make. As you have probably noticed, our dueling club has become quite big." There were a few scattered laughs at that. "And we need better ways of communication than passing coded notes to one another in the hallways. I am therefore very pleased to inform you that our own Hermione Granger," he gestured at the blushing Gryffindor, "has created the perfect means for us to keep in touch. Hermione, if you would." The girl joined Harry on the makeshift stage, and began explaining, picking up confidence as she demonstrated the way the fake galleons worked. Harry was quite content to let her do the talking. The dueling club had certainly expanded in size since its conception. At the beginning, Harry had envisaged that, at most, there would be 40 people participating. Now, at the end of November, the population of the hidden room was somewhere closer to 80. Of course, the influx of people had receded once Blaise had procured the secrecy scroll, because not everyone and their mum could invite their friends to join any more, but there was still a steady trickle of students eager to defy Umbridge and learn defence. And that made for a lot of people who depended on Harry to provide that opportunity for them, and were grateful to him for making the effort. "Harry?" Hermione had apparently finished explaining her bit. Right, thank you, Hermione. Everybody will be getting a fake galleon when we leave after tonight's session. Fine, then. Moving on. Harry glanced at his notes. This week we're back to defensive spells for all, since they're a large component of owls and newts, and generally tend to come in useful. I'd like to ask anyone who's still having problems with the shield charm to stick with practicing that, though, because you just can't get around without it. If the shield charm is so wonderful, why do we even need other defensive spells? Lavender Brown asked, pouting. After all, learning different counter curses was a lot more interesting than drilling the same shield charm, Harry knew. Blocking incoming curses is essential, but sometimes you'll also need to reverse them, he said calmly, and owl examiners will check that you are not completely helpless when faced with a hex that doesn't happily resolve itself with a finite. Neville gave Harry a small smile when he had finished giving instructions, and got off the podium. Afraid I'm one of the people who can't do the shield properly yet. That's all right, Harry reassured him. You'll get it down soon. You're certainly trying hard enough. Sorry, Nev. I'll be right back. I'll see you after the session, right? Neville inquired. Since Harry and a lot of his friends were busy with various commitments this year, it was often easiest to find time to see his friends, especially the ones from other houses, after dueling club meetings. They'd stay after everyone else had left, transform the hidden room from a training area to a pleasant sitting room, and catch up with one another. Harry's friends knew that he set this time apart to see them, and often made an effort to clear their schedules accordingly, though it didn't always work. Millie and Blaise often skipped, neither particularly enthused about socializing with Harry's other friends, and generally spending more time with Harry than anyone else by virtue of sharing a house. Yeah, of course. We'll be meeting as usual, Harry said. Out of the corner of his eye he glimpsed a nearby group of fourth-year Hufflepuffs throw Neville envious glances at that, but he didn't have time to think on it. Cedric was waving him over. When do you want to hold the advanced group meeting? He asked. I think everyone agrees on this Thursday, Harry said. The advanced group has different fake galleons, so I'll contact you through those if anything changes. Are you staying after? Nope, Cedric murmured, watching as Luna cast the choking curse on Neville, and Neville attempted to block it. I've got head boy and girl meeting with Dumbledore. Do you think we'll need to cart anyone off to the infirmary at the end of this? We haven't yet, Harry said optimistically. The meeting proceeded in the usual state of controlled chaos. Astoria Greengrass turned into a canary thanks to the Weasley twins. Angelina Johnson was, by all appearances, trying to kill Lee Jordan, and Hannah Abbott, Tracy Davis, and Lavender Brown exchanged latest gossip right in the midst of Spellfire. Susan Bones looked kind of lonely, Harry decided. It was only gentlemanly to approach her. You should do a slight flourish here, not too much, though just like that, Harry said, coming up to where Susan was standing. Susan smiled at him. The cute dimples of doom were back, Harry noticed at once. Thanks, Harry. I don't know why I always get it wrong. Harry smiled back. Lots of people do, so no worries. We could meet up to practice, though. Aren't you very busy? Susan asked, twirling her long plait between her fingers. Would you have time just to help me? Harry gathered his confidence. Well, there's always the next Hogsmeade weekend. He hoped that the din of practice would drown out his conversation with Susan, because he really wouldn't like his private life to become a matter of public interest before said private life even materialized. Susan cocked her head slightly to the side. Is that a date, then? She asked. There was no real flirtatiousness in her manner. She did not suddenly start blushing and stammering, and neither did she take on coy airs along the lines of Padma's. As usual, she appeared very down-to-earth and not dazzled by Harry's fame. And, well, pretty, which made her sort of scary, even though Harry knew she was really nice. Yes, it would be a date, he confirmed, hoping he didn't sound as awkward as he felt. If you would agree, of course. Susan's cheeks were a little pink as she said, Oh, I'd be glad to. Harry smiled, breathing easier now that the trickiest part was over. I should warn you in advance that I'm terrified of Madame Puddifoot's tea shop. he said. So, if you don't mind 3 broomsticks? Susan laughed. Don't worry, I will not drag you to Madame Puddifoot's, she promised. So, shall we meet in the entrance hall on Saturday? Harry suggested. Yes, let's, Susan agreed, and gave him another smile. I look forward to it, Harry, and thank you for showing me the spell. Harry would have liked to stay and chat with Susan some more, but the group's training hour was drawing to a close, and he still had rounds to make. At the end of the meeting, Susan left with Hannah Abbott and Ernie Macmillan, and Harry stayed behind with his friends as usual. They exited the hidden room and re-entered after requesting a comfortable lounge. Luna, Hermione, and Padma barely noticed the change in decor, engrossed as they were in arguing about the magical properties of the hidden room. Terry and Anthony listened to the discussion in interest, offering comments when they felt particularly brave. Harry sat down on the couch between Fred and George. "My noble-hearted friends," he said, "I've been thinking." "And how did that go for you?" Fred inquired politely. "It was very refreshing, thank you. As it happens, I was wondering, how is your product development going?" The red-headed duo perked up at once. "Swimmingly," Fred proclaimed. "We have perfected the skiving snack boxes, thanks to young Neville and his Mimbleless Mimbletonia, and we are currently working on a portable swamp, which should be a delightful invention." "And let us not forget the Weasleys' wildfire whiz-bangs," George chimed in. "On a more serious note, we're developing something called decode detonators, but they're not quite ready. We've also got a few interesting ingredients from overseas." "In addition, we feel that there is a certain lonely woman at Hogwarts," Fred said, "who would greatly benefit from some humour in her life, and we do really need test subjects." Harry raised a sceptical eyebrow. "Come on, Harry," George said. "You said it yourself that you wanted to drive her out of Hogwarts. Why not have fun while we're doing it?" "She's kind of grown on me," Harry confided. "No, really, I don't think I could go a day without seeing her bright pink robes." "Right," Fred said, and exchanged a concerned glance with George. "You haven't been taking any strange potions, have you, Harry?" Harry sighed. "Look, it's a long story, but basically Umbridge is annoying as hell, but she's actually been very good for the dueling club's publicity so far." "So you're thinking of keeping her?" George said, unimpressed. "For a while longer," Harry hedged. "Not forever. As long as she's not doing anything too damaging, and until she outlives her usefulness." "Being your enemy must be so much fun," Fred mused. "I don't think I could think of mine in such caring terms." "Well," George said, "for our forbearance, you owe us a little fun at her expense, Harry. Just a wee bit. Perfectly harmless. It's not like she'll run to the ministry complaining about silly jokes. It's going to make her look like an idiot." That much was probably true. "Just be careful, okay? The fact that I want to keep her doesn't make her any less dangerous. She's just less dangerous politically than her replacement might be, that's all. So, don't get caught. I mean it." "Don't worry, Harry," Fred said, blinking innocently. "Don't you trust us?" "Does your mother?" Harry's composure cracked at the sight of identical grimaces on both twins' faces. After his date with Susan, Harry spent a few days feeling unusually well-disposed towards the world. Blaise teased him ceaselessly, of course. "Looking thoughtful there, Harry. Not composing a sonnet in honour of Miss Bones' beauty, are you?" Harry ignored him, because he was cool and mature like that. He hadn't been planning to advertise his interest in Susan, so he got a bit annoyed when, in a week's time, everyone in the school seemed to know that he and Susan had gone on a date. Still, it wasn't enough to spoil his enjoyment of Susan's company by any means, and it felt like December had generally been going well for him, until the day before the end of term. "Mr. Potter," Professor McGonagall said, just as the Transfiguration lesson were wrapped up. "Please stay behind." Harry shrugged at Blaise and Millie, indicating that he had no idea what this was about, and walked up to the teacher's desk. "The headmaster wishes to speak to you after this class," the Gryffindor head of house explained. "The password to his office is Fizzing Wisby." Harry wondered whether the summons had anything to do with the multitude of jokes played on Umbridge recently. "Should I be worried, Professor?" he asked, giving McGonagall a sheepish smile. The lines around her eyes softened a little, even as she pursed her lips. McGonagall liked Harry, as did most teachers. Harry was a good student, even if transfiguration was a subject he struggled with. He was infallibly respectful, and he was the son of Lily and James Potter, who seemed to have charmed most of the teaching staff back in their student days. McGonagall had even expressed the sentiment that Harry should have become the Slytherin prefect this year, in place of Mr. Malfoy, said with a drawing of eyebrows and a slight inflection on the word Malfoy that carried McGonagall's disbelief that he was at all suited for prefect duties. McGonagall busied herself with papers on her desk. "You're not in trouble, Mr. Potter," she said. Someone was, though. Prepared for bad news, Harry headed to Dumbledore's office and gave the password to the gloomy gargoyle. For the third time in his life, he found himself in a large, circular room with a great number of mysterious instruments in it, some whizzing quietly, and others puffing out little clouds of smoke. The headmaster was seated behind his desk. "Harry," he said amiably, "good to see you. Please sit down." Harry lowered himself into a chintz chair. "I trust you are doing well, Harry." "Yes, thank you, headmaster. However, I have potions after this break, and I would really not want to be late." He made a slight pause. "There was something you wanted to talk to me about?" "To business, then, if you insist." Dumbledore's expression changed imperceptibly. Suddenly his mirthful wrinkles folded into lines of sorrow. "A great tragedy has befallen the Weasley family, Harry." Harry held himself very still. "What happened?" "Arthur Weasley. He's no longer with us." "He's dead?" "His body was found at the Ministry last night," Dumbledore said with deep regret. Harry was silent for a moment or two, trying to get his thoughts in order. "Was there a fight?" "We do not know. Arthur was bitten to death by a snake," Dumbledore said. "Whether there were any humans accompanying the reptile, we cannot be sure." "A snake," Harry repeated. "A snake biting people at the Ministry? Was he on duty for the Order? Was he standing guard near the prophecy when—" Dumbledore inclined his head. "I am afraid so, Harry." The Sorting Hat sneezed. The Weasley children were sent to your godfather's home this morning," Dumbledore supplied. "I presume you are not averse to staying here until tomorrow, as per the original plan?" Harry assured him that he didn't mind. He was not eager to return to Grimmauld Place earlier than needed. He did not want to intrude on the Weasleys' tragedy when it was still so fresh. He'd rather not return to Grimmauld Place at all, actually, but he couldn't stay at Hogwarts unless he wanted to find himself in a near-empty castle together with Umbridge, and the Longbottom Manor was not safe enough at the moment, considering how much of a risk it was for Harry to appear anywhere. Fortunately, Susan hadn't noticed the Order bodyguards tailing them last week in Hogsmeade. By lunchtime the news was splashed all over the newspapers. Harry hadn't had the time to inform his friends before they'd read the scathing obituaries, so most of them had found out from Rita Skeeter rather than from him. Harry did, however, provide some explanations. "Arthur Weasley was doing stuff for the Order when he died," he said. "Not that the Order would tell that to the Ministry, and the Ministry will not accept the idea of foul play anyway. I'm sure they'll chalk it up to some accident." "And drown it in red tape," Cedric said darkly. Most of Harry's friends were sympathetic towards the Weasleys. Not all of them, of course. "One Weasley less," Blaise said with a shrug. "There's so many of them. Do you think anyone will notice the difference?" Blaise was, of course, not the only person at Hogwarts to ridicule Mr. Weasley's demise. Malfoy was getting a positive thrill out of the whole affair, and some others muttered ominously about blood traitors and what tended to happen to them. Dolores Umbridge gleefully informed the class that Arthur Weasley must have blown himself up on those muggle devices he was so fond of. And Harry would be lying if he said that he'd cared for Mr. Weasley, but he could sympathize with his children, and he found the vultures preying on his corpse unpleasant enough that he was actually glad to leave for Grimmauld Place, despite what was waiting for him there. The twins cornered Harry at once. He'd only had the time to put his suitcase down in his bedroom at Grimmauld Place and visit the loo when the twins pounced on him in his room, faces pale and something glittering in their eyes that worried Harry on a visceral level. No one will tell us anything. Dad died, and no one will tell us anything, as if the rotten order matters more than he does. And they knew that Harry would know. They advanced at Harry, desperate for an explanation, and Harry wondered for the first time if this was what Dumbledore experienced when Harry pressed him for information. "We're not stupid. We know Dad died doing stuff for the Order, but snake bites? What was he doing that—" These were not Harry's secrets to share, exactly, and the one that was, regarding the prophecy, he wasn't going to share, especially not right now. However, the twins deserved to know more than they currently did. They deserved to know that their father hadn't been just taking a stroll through the Ministry. They deserved to know why he'd been there and why he'd died. So Harry told them. The twins absorbed the information in uncharacteristic silence. There were other things that Harry needed to say to them, condolences he needed to give, sympathy he needed to express through different means than telling his friends of their father's murder. But something in the twins' expressions checked Harry's tongue, and he didn't know the first thing about giving comfort anyway. "I'm sorry," he said at the end of his tale, and that was the extent of it. Next time he saw Fred and George, they were huddled with Ron and Ginny on a dark staircase that led up from the ground floor, and listening to Bill and Percy shout in the kitchen. "Was Dad running here errands for Dumbledore when he died?" Percy demanded, voice tinged with hysteria. "Was he? Was he, Bill?" "He wasn't running errands, he was— You don't get it, do you? There are some things worth dying for." "Then what did he die for?" Fred looked at Harry over the top of Ginny's head, cradled against his chest. His eyes stood out, dark and feverish, against his pale face, and Harry could read the same question in them. Death in the line of duty sounded noble, but what did it actually mean? "Has Dad's death changed anything?" Percy continued, after a moment of ringing silence. "This is what I told you about. We will all be ruined by this." "But don't you see? You know who really is back, and he's killed Dad, and we were right all along. Dad died fighting him, and you—" "I don't care that he's back. I care that Dad trusted in Dumbledore's schemes, and now he's dead." Ron folded in on himself at that, hiding his face, and George laid a hand on his shoulder, looking just as lost. Harry might not be able to express it well, or at all, but he did understand. It was one thing to know rationally what war was. It was another thing completely to have it hit your home and destroy the safe haven you hadn't known to value until you lost it. Last August war had come to Harry's home too, in a swirl of black cloaks and deathly breath. War had come to him, war had looked at him through the shattered hope in Dudley's eyes, and he hadn't understood it then, but later, much later, he'd stared the truth in the face. He'd thought he was safe. He'd hated Privet Drive all his life, but he'd allowed himself to think that the war wouldn't follow him there, that it would not find him in that insular world of gossipy neighbours and manicured lawns. He'd thought he was ready, firm in his decision to fight Voldemort, but he'd still ran from it all and had been glad to have a place to run to. He had no such place any longer. Right now, in addition to dealing with grief over Mr. Weasley's death, the twins had to acknowledge the same thing, that, in a war, there were no safe places, no untouchable people, and that someone was inevitably bound to get a shitty ending. Harry would have spared his friends that knowledge if he'd had the chance.